Hello everyone. Welcome to Cracks in the Wall. What can we do about Israel? And I want to dedicate the class to in honor of mother of Mark Belinsky, Asya Baz Ben Sion Allah Hashalom Shloshim 19th Tammuz, which is when? Which is basically tomorrow, tonight. Right, okay. So in honor, sadly, Mark's mother passed away 30 days ago. I wasn't here actually, so we could say Hamalkim Menachem Eschem B'Sech Shar L'Tzion Shalayim, and you should be only consoled and have joy and simchas together with Rebecca, your daughter. Mark is, we know Mark already, MLC, now how long at least? 13 years, Bar Mitzvah? Okay. So it's an honor, and may the neshama of your mother grow through our class here tonight, and may she give us in turn blessings in every possible way. So we all are eyes glued yet again to the Middle East, Israel. It's not just us as Jews, but wherever you turn, you see the headlines. It's hard to ignore the phenomenon, if that's the best word I can find, that Jerusalem is still in the news, basically. Israel is still in the news. What do I mean by still? Yesterday was the 17th of Tammuz, fast day, where we began the traditional mourning period of the 3 weeks, which will conclude on Tisha B'Av, hopefully together with Mashiach. But for the last 2,346 years, I believe, when the Babylonians first breached the walls of Jerusalem and then finally and ultimately destroyed the temple, and even more what can we say, even more serendipitous was the fact that exactly 490 years later, according to most opinions, the Romans did exactly the same thing on exactly the same day. There are two opinions whether the breaching of the wall was on the 17th of Tammuz at both temples, but both temples were definitely burned down on the same day, Tisha B'Av, which was 1900 and I believe 64 years ago. So we're talking about 2,000 years basically. The first temple stood for 410 years. The second temple stood for 420 years. So you have to wonder how the same piece of land, right there, Israel, has been under attack, under siege, going back thousands of years till this very day. And we all know history, a lot of things have changed from then till today, you would agree, right? For example, they didn't have email then. So that's from the small things. There were a lot of other changes. They didn't have fax machine, no cell phones. And definitely no ability to broadcast a class across the earth. Those are just the technological changes. I mean, everything changed. Not just history, but advancements in so many different places, so many different ways. And yet, one thing has not changed. Israel is still the headlines. You can't deny that. Small little country the size of New Jersey, approximately. Not to degrade, not to in any way denigrate New Jersey, but it's a small little land. Actually, I once heard from a PR firm that Israel is a great place for PR because though it's a country, but you can treat it like a city where you can buy basically advertising in 3-4 newspapers and the whole country sees it. In the United States, if you want everyone to see it, you got to buy it in every major city. So you can get a lot more for your bang for your buck, just in case you were interested in this small piece of trivia. Obviously, it's quite trivial compared to what we're addressing, but I just thought to mention it. So Israel, this small little country, it dominates the headlines far disproportionate to its size, to its population. I mean, we're talking about 6-7 million people, maybe 8 million people. I mean, compared to, let's say, a country like China, which has 1.8 billion people. And China, how often is China in the headlines? Maybe recently, business terms and so on, but not throughout history. So it has to catch the eye of every person, even if you're not Jewish. You go to Israel, any given time, for example, you go to the Kotel, you meet not just thousands of Jews, you'll always see, every time I've been there, and I hear from others, you always have a group from Oklahoma City, from Austin, Texas, from Kansas City. These are the Christian evangelicals, the Christian right, who consider Israel the promised land and the Jews the chosen people. So clearly, this is as I said, a phenomenon. Israel in the center of the universe. Now, if you know a little Medrash and Talmud, and definitely the Torah itself, the Bible, Israel is called the promised land. Why was it promised? Because God promised it to Abraham, and to Isaac, and to Jacob, and then He delivered on His promise that even though they went through different upheavals, but finally, after the Jews ultimately left Egypt, which was also another chapter, and 40 years wandering in the wilderness, the Bible concludes with the Jews standing by the edge, which we'll read next week, literally coming to that part of the chapter, where they conclude their long 40-year journey, which is actually 42 small journeys that they took, the 42 stops they made, Matos as it's called. Next week's chapter is called Elamasa, these are the journeys, and they finally come to the east bank of the river Jordan. Just to show you how central Israel is in the Bible, to drive the point home, I've mentioned this a number of times, but every time, even those of us that are familiar with Torah, are not always aware of the intense this fact. If you read the Torah, the Bible, from a point of view, let's say historical context, so here's how it works. The book of Genesis, Chumash Bereshis, begins with, of course, the creation, Adam and Eve, and it concludes basically with the death of Jacob, the passing of Jacob and the tribes. A period of around 2,000 years, the span of things. The next book, Exodus, the book of Exodus begins with the exile in Egypt, which we know would last 210 years, and that only spans 2.5 chapters. Shmois Va'era, middle of Boy, the first 2.5 chapters in the book of Exodus, in the book of Shmois, cover the exile and the exodus from Egypt. And listen to this. So we have one book and 2.5 chapters. After that, the rest of the entire Torah covers only 40 years. Because once they left Egypt, which was the middle of chapter Boy, Pasha Boy, what happens next? They begin their journey. They begin their journey first, parting of the sea, then Sinai 49 days later, and the rest of it is only 40 years. So it's interesting that basically, I would say at least maybe 4/5 of the Torah, a little less than 4/5 of the Torah, is a 40-year span, all about the journey in the wilderness, and we don't even end up with a happy ending. They end up at the river Jordan on the east bank. Moses passes away, and they don't enter Promised Land until the book of Joshua, which is after Chumash. Just interesting context. I remember Philip, who's giving a class tonight, I was told, tomorrow night? Tomorrow night, sorry. Yeah, good point. As the mayor notified us, right? When the first time I think he finished reading the Bible, and he was someone who came from a completely different world, he said, when you look at the Bible with fresh eyes, I grew up with it, so sometimes you miss the main point. When you grow up, you're so close to something, you miss both, So he pointed out to me, he says, the book is like, doesn't even have a happy ending. You think the end, at least, every movie, every book usually has a happy ending. Here, the ending is that after all that, all the journeys, you end up still not in the land. So, which is an interesting insight, but the point I want to make is how central Israel is to the Torah, that 40 years, just the journey toward the Promised Land, becomes the big bulk, the main bulk of the entire Torah. And it's obvious because you read through in the Torah again and again. I don't know how many times it's mentioned. I think there are already statistics that say that the land of Israel is mentioned, I'm not sure how many times, it's hundreds of times in the Torah. The promised land, the Holy Land. And until this day it remains that way. So when you're familiar with the reasons for this, it's not surprising why Israel still dominates headlines completely, as I said, disproportionate to its size, to its significance. It could have been, there are countries that we don't even know. You ever hear of a country like Luxembourg? Okay? I mean, people know about it because of the banking or whatever is going on there. Or Sri Lanka. I'm trying to think of something that nobody's familiar with. But I mean, you get the idea. Countries you barely hear about, unless there's some, God forbid, a tragedy or some other thing of news. And the answer is because this land is not just geographically significant, but also because it actually is a holy land. And holiness attracts people. So we have to define what holiness, of course, is. Because the question is, why this of all lands? Why did God choose Israel? He could have chosen any piece of land. Remember, the beginning of time, no one yet staked any territory. So when God said to Abraham grew up in the south, what is today southeast Iraq. And he had him travel northwest to go to Eretz Canaan, which would later become Israel, and said, that's the land I will give you. Why? You know, the Garden of Eden is not in the Promised Land. The Garden of Eden, though there's no clear picture where exactly on the map it is, but it's probably close to somewhere, the southern tip of the Persian Gulf, which is basically around the Iraq area. Because we do have in the Torah, there's the landmark that speaks about the 4 rivers, the Euphrates and the Tigris and other 2 rivers. But there's a whole discussion and debates where exactly was the Garden of Eden. But no one says it was in Israel. So clearly civilization, according to the Torah, did not begin in Israel. It began elsewhere. If you were more interested in this, I actually wrote right after 9/11, all these things were very intriguing to everybody, still they are. I wrote a whole a few essays on the search for Eden. The different opinions and the different views, both secular scientific research that's been done, and of course Torah research. So if you're interested, just send us an email, and I'm happy to send you the articles. It's easy to find. You go to our website, meaningfullife.com, and just search for Eden. Where is Eden or something? You'll find. But if you need more help, just email us. So it becomes even more fascinating. So then, why Israel? Nothing had happened yet. There was no temple yet. No one lived there. It all began, as I said, Adam and Eve started elsewhere. So why not Iraq? Modern day Iraq, called Persia, whatever it was called then, Babylon, the different name, Mesopotamia. So there's an interesting medrash that talks about this. Is the land holy because the Jews settled in it and sanctified it and built a temple there? Or did they build a temple because it was holy? Where does it begin? And the answer is obviously the latter is true. Even though what human beings do also has an effect. So just as a small footnote, maybe not a footnote, a small introduction, which is very important. In Judaism, we read a lot about sanctifying life. Kadoshim tiyu, you should be sanctified. V'hiyisam kadoshim, v'hiskadashtem, sanctify. You see it very many times, especially in the book of Leviticus. The word Kodesh. Am Kodesh, a holy nation, holy land, a holy person. What exactly is sanctity and what does it signify? So it's interesting. We call Shabbos Kodesh, right? The holy Shabbos. But we also say about the holidays, we say the holidays are Kedusha too. They're holy holidays. That's why they're called holidays. Some people, holidays is like a holy day. But there's a big difference between a holiday and a Shabbat. Shabbos is what the Torah says, Makatsha Makaima, which means God designated the 7th day. As you read in the Torah, 6 days God created the universe, and then the 7th day God rested, however you interpret that. I'll explain in a moment. And that's Shabbat. Holidays, it says, were designated not by God, even though the Torah says the 15th of the month is Passover, the 1st of the month of Tishrei, and Nisan that is Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur is the 10th, but who designates the new moon, the new month? How do you designate a month? So we know that in the olden days, today is done with the calculations, in the olden days what they did was they actually counted by the moon, like today, we Mekadesh Es HaLevon, it's also sanctifying the moon, and they designated the Bezdin, the court, designated when the new moon was sighted by 2 witnesses. It was a whole process. They designated that the new month. Today, as a result of calculations actually made back then by Hillel Hazaken, fascinating astronomical calculations that hold true till this day, they were able to calculate it all, but it was still designated by human beings. So in Hasidic and Kabbalistic thought, it explains that there are 2 types of sanctity. There's a sanctity that comes from above. God can sanctify someone. For example, the tribe of Levi, the high priest. He's not appointed he's not elected. This is God chose a tribe and said this tribe that will separate itself from mundane activities is a sacred tribe among all the Jewish people. Same thing with nations. God could sanctify someone. Sanctify time, space, or human beings. But then there's a sanctity that we initiate. What does that mean? A sanctity, when you sanctify your life, you do something. You designate, let's say, a time to, instead of using it for your own selfish interests, you designate it for some type of holy purpose, something that helps and serves other people, or serves a higher purpose, then you have sanctified that moment. So really, sanctity almost like meets in two different directions. There are things that we're given that are sanctified, and there are things that we sanctify. And the truth is, they both are necessary, because that which is given from above is like a gift. But what you sanctify, you own. So, for example, take a Torah scroll. A Torah scroll is sanctified by human beings. The Torah scroll began as a piece of flesh of the skin of an animal. That's what parchment is. That animal was then skinned, that was dried, was turned into parchment. A scribe wrote the holy letters of the Torah on this parchment with ink and quill, and then that becomes a sacred Sefer Torah that lies in the Torah scroll, a Torah scroll inside the ark, which we rise for and we consider a sacred object. That's an example of sanctify. But what really is the definition of Kedusha? What does it mean? So to put it very simply put, think of it this way. The material world has many layers. For example, if you were someone to ask you, where do you see subatomic energy? Do you see electricity? The answer is we don't see it with our eyes, but we can experience it through different experiments or through different applications and so on. The same thing is with divine energy. The whole universe, from the perspective, this is especially the way the mystics put it, is really the divine breath. This universe is essentially a divine expression. Think of an artist who creates a beautiful piece of art. Except when it comes to a human artist, the art and the artist are two separate things. Once he created the art, or she created it, then the art no longer is dependent on the artist. But when it comes to the universe that we live in, existence as we know it, the artist always has to be keeping his quill to the canvas, which is essentially the concept that the Baal Shem Tov elaborates on, what's called perpetual creation, that the universe is constantly being renewed. And this today is very consistent with modern physics, that we do not live in a dead universe, in an inanimate universe. The universe is a dynamic universe. There's subatomic particles always pulsating, whether you feel it or you see it or not. But it's all under the surface. So the way the mystics explain it is that nature, the word for nature, you know the word in Hebrew for nature? Teva. Teva comes from the same root as submerged. Teva comes from the word tavu, something that's sunk in. Like when you throw an object into a sea, it's called tavu b'yamsuf. It's submerged to the point you don't see the object any longer. It's completely submerged, covered up by the sea. So the way they explain nature is the same thing. Nature covers up on the divine forces that are beneath the surface, and we can convince ourselves it's just working on its own, as so many people do. But nothing works on its own. Every building testifies to its architect, every book to an author, every music to a composer. So why this beautiful universe has beneath the surface an architect, the cosmic engineer, except God has concealed himself. What the Lurianic Kabbalah, Isaac Lurie, the Arizal says, is called the Great Tzimtzum. Great Tzimtzum is a concealment that we do not see. It's like submerged. So we call it nature, an act of nature. You have an act of nature. You could easily replace act of nature with act of God. And actually, in insurance policies, they do exactly that. Insurance policies, it's always acts of God. I once asked a person who works in insurance who told me he's an atheist, I said, you sell policies every day that say acts of God. So jokingly he said, but this is, I think, not so jokingly, I want you to write acts of nature. Because if you're sued, it's far easier. If you say nature, maybe the insurance company should be responsible for nature. But if it's God, you can blame it on God. We don't have to pay. Go to God. Why he created a hurricane, why he created a flood, etc., etc. So suddenly when it's convenient for economic purposes, they use acts of God. Just as an aside. But, I remember traveling once, I was flying from California, and I had JetBlue, so I was watching this Discovery Channel. So they had I think it was this hour show about the last 15 billion years. How did the world become? What the world was like 15 billion years ago? How it became what it is today. It was a very fascinating show. Literally, the way science sees the process of evolution. And I must tell you, I counted almost. I think at least 70 times in 1 hour, they mentioned the miracle of nature. That it happened to be that the primates were in the trees, and one day there was a storm, so they could not stay in the tree. They had to go climb down, and therefore they started walking upright. It happened to be, literally, so it was the miracle of nature, why the amphibians suddenly decided to crawl out of the water and then developed legs, etc., etc. I have no problem. Forget about the theory of evolution. I'm not getting into it, but it was fascinating to me. It was like the most God-based show I've ever seen, but they would never use the word God. They called it the miracle of nature. They kept saying, like a rat. Now, if you really added them all up, it's like almost impossible that all of these things should have just happened. Anyway, I'm not trying to make a case here for God. I'm just saying it's fascinating how, to me, it demonstrates what the Kabbalists say. It's submerged. It's so easy to say it just does it on its own. It's a machine that's working on its own. So that is what sanctity is. What's sanctity? It's recognizing. Instead of thinking you're a self-made creature, it's recognizing that your parents did something and sacrificed something for you. And they were there, and they had their parents. And they were not self-made entities. Every person in this room, every person on earth, has all kinds of factors that brought you where you are today. If we had healthy parents, thank God. If we did not have healthy parents, that can be sad. But nobody is just, I am self-made. We all have to acknowledge that. And that humble acknowledgement is called a sanctifying act. It's not just about me. Ani v'avsei, me and nothing else. It's recognizing the underlying forces that shape you. When you do that, you've sanctified your existence. When on Shabbat, after 6 days of hard work, where we achieve many things, we step back and we say, today is a day of rest, which that means, what does that mean? God needed to rest after 6 days? And let's be honest, did he even need 6 days to create? If you're a creator, you can do it in a second. If you're not a creator, 6 million days won't help. So, because he wanted to create a structured existence in a way that we can relate to it, and the seventh day, God is saying, I applied myself now in creating a material world. Now I go back to, so to speak, my natural place. Like many people will say, I'm busy at work all day, but if you want to know who I am, my real beak, see how I am with my children when I come home. Don't look at me, the shark, at work. So Shabbat is basically a day where we go back, so to speak, to our natural selves. To your soul. Instead of being immersed in the material world, we try to minimize as much possible material creativity in order to access what you really are. Think of it this way. Think of it this exercise. Someone once asked me, why can't I do this? Why can't I go shopping? Why can't I do this? I said, think of it this way. Imagine if you were to shut down your 5 senses. You close your eyes, your ears, your taste, touch, and smell. What would you be left with? So initially, many people think, I just disappear. You wouldn't disappear. You'd be left with the real you. Because remember, you don't need eyes to see yourself. You don't need ears, taste, touch, and smell to experience yourself. These are only channels to interact. We need eyes to see others, or for them to see us. Same thing with ears. But we're so overstimulated by the sensual experiences of our lives, the sensory experiences, I should say, that it completely overwhelms us, and we don't smell the roses. The Baal Shem Tov has a beautiful a line where he says, what's the difference between a miracle and a natural event? Talk about teva, nature. So he says it's only frequency. Only frequency. If the sun were to rise once in our lifetimes, everyone would come rushing out. Wow, look at this event. We'd have camera crews, families. We'd probably have a whole festival. See this beautiful sun rising. But since it happens every morning, we take it for granted. We are fickle, and we need a new novel. We need something novel, something dramatic, something different. That's why for a mystic or for a chassid, when they see the universe, they don't need to go and create some type of novelty. Every ordinary experience is really extraordinary if you are able to see what's beneath the water. The problem is nature covers it up, and nature just says, hey, it happens all the time. So a miracle is basically nature is a bunch of miracles, perpetual miracles happening so often that we don't even notice them. It's not about the parting of the sea. It's seeing the extraordinary within the ordinary. I mean, I don't have to tell if any one of you have experienced a birth, if any of you are mothers in this room, or if you're a father, or if you thought about it. You tell me, is there anyone who's witnessed a birth or been involved in the birth? No way that moment they don't see something that is awesome. And then we forget. Then we say, okay, and millions of children are being born. But you cannot deny the awesome thing. Suddenly a child. Suddenly here we are sitting here, 5-6 foot frames, going to therapy and all our neurosis. We popped out from our mother's womb. And where'd that come from? Come on. No one can explain it. And I'm not trying to suggest that there isn't a science behind it, and today, of course, there's a lot of understanding. But that moment of conception is, the miracle of all miracles. Except it's easy to take for granted because it happens so often. But you step back, is there a greater miracle on earth? There isn't. That scientist that says to God, I can do anything you can do. Like the wizards, the sorcerers of Pharaoh said, I can do anything you can do, they told Moses. So God says, go ahead, let me show me what you can do. So the scientist takes a bunch of earth from a garden and is going to replicate in a lab, in a, what do they call it, in a dish, a plant. So God says, no. Use your own earth, Yeah, you're taking my earth and you're going to do it. Use your own earth. Even with all the advancements in infertility and IVF, etc., it's all ultimately using material that exists. No one's creating it from scratch. Except we can do it today outside of the womb, and a lot of miracles that can be done, saving lives, giving a hope for people, for women and men that have difficult fertility issues, etc. No one's taking away, but let's not replace that as if we're creating it from scratch. We're replicating. At the end of the day, technology is a replication of nature. A camera is replicating an eye, and an airplane is replicating a bird. And the replications are never as good as the original, as we know, even though we love our gadgets. Like the one where the guy's a new couple are rolling their carriage with a newborn baby. Someone comes over and says, "What a beautiful baby," and the parents say, "That's nothing. You should see the photo." The photo sometimes more important than the original. But anyway, this is just a little social satire. On a serious note, this is the definition of sanctity, and I know you may never have heard it this way put. But that's really sanctity. What's a sacred moment? A sacred moment is recognizing the extraordinary in the ordinary. You could be standing at a chuppah, a wedding ceremony, and just see it as yet another party, and I can't wait to get to the food, etc. Or you can see it as a sacred moment, a union of two souls that ripple through all of existence as they unify all the levels as explained in Kabbalistic, Hasidic, and the Talmudic thought as well. Everything is that way. So we have the choice to sanctify any moment in time. Now, obviously, there are times when it's easier for us because God already helped us sanctify it, like Shabbat or the holidays. That's in time. The same thing is in human beings. It says Am Kodesh, right? We say in Havdalah that God separated and said Atem Tili Mamlechas Kayanim v'Goy Kodesh. Before Sinai, you shall be for me a kingdom of priests, and Goy Kodesh, and a holy nation. So, what does that mean? And of course, it's the controversial question: are the Jews the chosen people? Yes, chosen. But every human being on earth was chosen. They wouldn't be here if God didn't choose them. So it's not about others are not chosen. Everybody can sanctify their life. Yom Kippur, is it the holiest day of the year? That's correct, in time. But does that mean that you cannot access God in the middle of a Wednesday right now on the 18th of Tammuz? Or the night of the 19th of Tammuz? It's one God, Hashem Echad. However, now it's harder because there are more layers. We're more distracted. We're busy at work. But beneath the surface lies the God that's there Yom Kippur too. Why is Yom Kippur extraordinary? Because God chose a day, and there are many reasons why that day, that's not for now, I've discussed it other times, that day is more conducive. There are less layers. Think of it, less veils, less shrouds, whatever you want to call it. So it's easier. The Kotel. We go to the Kotel. What, God is only at the Kotel? The temple, God only rested in the temple? V'shachanti b'tocham? There it's more conducive. It's more conducive because in some way, as I'll explain in a moment, Israel and Jerusalem, and particularly the Temple Mount, retains a certain character that makes it more conducive to the divine. It doesn't mean there's more of God in one place or another. You can't, as I said, divide God into parts. So the way the Sefer Yetzirah, the book of formation, puts it, is that everything in existence breaks into Olam, Shana, Nefesh. Using modern physics language, time, space, and man. Or we would say Olam is space, Shana is time, Nefesh is soul, person. So it's interesting, the Sefer Yetzirah, which precedes by thousands of years, modern science, used that principle. Oshan. It's an acronym actually for the word Oshan. Olam, Shana, Nefesh. And it says, anything that exists in space exists in time and exists inside of us. So we have a very symbiotic universe that consists of this triad, this triangle, time, space, and you. And it's up to the human being what you're going to do with that time and space. So in that context, I mentioned holy spaces, holy time rather, a holy person. You say a tzaddik, a righteous person. What, he's more godly than all of us? We all have a divine soul. But here's a person who's so saturated that he's become a transparent channel due to his humility or her humility to divine energy. The rest of us have other agendas that so-called block out the divine within us. Not block, they obfuscate it. But that's what, when a human being dedicates their entire life, not to themselves, but to serve a higher purpose, they are called a holier person. It's not about superior, it's not about even, they said, they're more godly in their behavior. But because of that, they become, so to speak, the outer and the inner become a seamless flow. Where for the rest of us, our outer and our inner are not that aligned. So yes, a criminal in prison also has a holy soul. But that holy soul is like a pilot flame that's not saturating and definitely not permeating, definitely not saturating the rest of his being. So we say he has the potential. But when a person actually lives up to that potential, they are considered a sacred person. That's what's called a man of God or a woman of God. So now, going to space, the same is true. God also chose a space on earth that would be easier and more conducive to connect. So let's share the story, very famous story, everybody knows it. The story of Jacob's ladder. What happens? Jacob's leaving Vayetze Be'er Sheva. He leaves Be'er Sheva, which is a city today that's also under siege. And he leaves going Vayelech Harana. He goes to Haran, which is like northeast of Beersheba. Goes back to the place more or less where Abraham originated from to find himself a bride. This is the chapter of Vayetze. So the beginning of the story goes, so Jacob went and rested that night. So it became evening, the sun set, and he lay down, he fell asleep. And he dreamt the famous dream of the ladder, with the angels going up and the angels coming down. And then he was frightened, and that's when he wakes up and realizes this is a special place. And he was very disturbed. He says, how did I not sense that this was a holy place? I was able to just fall asleep here. And it says there's Zeh Shara Shamayim. And we know that this was the Temple Mount. On his journey from Beersheba going northeast, he ended up falling asleep on the Temple Mount, the place where the temple would later be built. Har Moriah. Temple Mount, the same Temple Mount that we see today that is now basically desolate. Or there's a mosque or two right there. So Jacob fell asleep there and was disturbed. How could I not have been aware? And then the story continues how he's frightened about his journey. So God says to him, I will be with you, and don't be afraid. And you will, Ufarata is the famous story, the famous expression where God says to him, not only don't be afraid, but you will build a great nation. Ufaratsta yamav akedma v'tzefein v'negba. You will spread out to the right, to the east, and to the west, to the north, and to the south. And this land where you slept right now is the land that I will give you and your children and grandchildren. So it's again one of those promises for the promised land. So there's a lot to say about this chapter. I don't want to go into too detail because it's not really the focus. But there's a lot to say because what's going on here? Why did he fall asleep? What's the significance of the dream? But what I do want to point out is the words he uses. That's key. Zeh Shara Shamayim, he says. This is the gate to heaven. So Jacob gave us the description of what the Temple Mount is, which really what Israel is in the broader sense. The gate to heaven. As a matter of fact, you've all heard of the Shalah HaKadosh, the Shalah. Shalah was a man, Rabbi Yitzchak Horowitz, one of the greatest sages in the 16th century. He was one of the big rabbis in Krakow and some of the big cities, major cities in Europe. And the end of his life, as did the Nachmanides and others who were able, they tried to end their lives, go to Israel, and live the rest of their lives there to fulfill the mitzvah, whatever Israel, the specialness of Israel. He came at the end of his life to Israel. He's actually buried in Tveria, not far from the Rambam. And the Shalah composed many great works. His last work that he composed is a siddur. It's called the Siddur of Shalah. But what's the name he gave to it? Shara Shamayim, the gate to heaven, because he wrote it in Jerusalem. He gave it the name that Jacob used. Now, what does the gate to heaven mean exactly? We'll use a more modern word, a portal to heaven. A portal. Long before the web. It's a portal. It means exactly what I said before. Obviously, anywhere on earth, at any given moment, a person can connect to God. God is everywhere. God is right in here. He's within existence. So what you have to do is access Him. And yet we find that there are times and places where it's more conducive. To give an example, the Torah says, "B'chol kareinu alav," or "Dirsha Hashem be'imatzei." Besiege God when He's found. Karua b'yesakarav. Call to Him when He's close. So the Talmud immediately asks the question, what does that mean? He's to be found and He's close all the time. He says, no, this is talking about the 10 days of tshuva between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, because it's easier then to access. There are less layers. And there's a beautiful analogy given, which really, if you want to visualize what Israel is and why it's so powerful and special, is an analogy given. This is given, I believe, by the first time by maybe the Alter Rebbe or the Baal HaTanya, Shneur Zalman. So he describes the soul, based on the verse in the Proverbs. We know the soul is compared to a flame. Ner Hashem Nishmat Adam. The flame of God is the soul of a human being. Simply put, the soul by nature is like a flame. A flame licks the air, always transcends and defies gravity. So too the soul. If the soul is like a flame, the body is like a wick. The body grounds us. And the soul is always restless, like a flickering flame, always looking for something greater, which is that restless voice inside each of us that's looking for some transcendence. We're not satisfied with animal bliss. We're not satisfied with just survival. We are always searching. And we always have a measure of angst. And it's healthy to be that way. Angst that's not resolved, you have the tension without resolution would be called anxiety. But to have no angst at all, just to be completely content, there's no motivation. It's like that story I often tell with the Tzemach Tzedek. He was a little child playing with other children. They were climbing a ladder. And all the other children were afraid to climb to the top. He climbed to the top. So his grandfather, Rabbi Shneur Zalman, the same man I'm mentioning, said to him, why were you the only one that had the courage to climb to the top? So he said, very simple, Zayda. Zayda is grandpa in Yiddish. He said, because other children, when they were climbing, they kept looking down. So they saw how high they were afraid to climb higher. When I was climbing, I kept looking up. So I saw how low I was, so it motivated me to climb higher. Now you can imagine a child that can answer that is going to become something. And he did. He became a great rabbi himself. But this is the soul. We all have these two options. You hang around with people that are less accomplished than you. Most likely, it'll bring you down a notch or two. It definitely is not going to motivate you. Because your ego says, hey, look how much I've accomplished compared to them. But then you meet people who are more accomplished than you look up, and you say, hey, 1 second. There's a certain tinge of healthy competitiveness or jealousy. Kinas sofrim tar b'chochma. You say, hey, you get motivated. That's how it is. If you look back, or you look down, you're pretty high. Sometimes you may even be afraid to go higher. You're already that high. You look up, you realize, 1 second, there are many horizons to conquer. So it's motivation. So going back to this, he says, so each soul is like a flame. And we all have that flame flickering right now inside of you. And when you feel restless, and you feel that life is, you're not satisfied with just survival, and you need some type of transcendence, whether it manifests in art, in music, in travel, in love, in sexuality, or religion and spirituality, this is the voice of your soul. Your soul is seeking something more than what is right here, present. It's more than instant gratification, more than the immediate. Temporary things. It's searching for something eternal. Something permanent, not impermanent. So he gives the analogy of a soul's orbit. Think of a soul now as being a spark. So when you look at sparks, think of a big flame, and then your sparks off. There are many sparks. So fire is very interesting. When the sparks are where they are, each spark has its own particular orbit. That's one thing. What happens when sparks get close to each other, or they get close to the mother flame? You see, they get drawn to each other. You ever take two flames? It's very interesting. We've all seen it, but it's a beautiful concept. They come close, they start being drawn to the point they just melt into each other. You can't even tell. It's if you were able to poetically describe it, you'd say like they were waiting to join, because they're suddenly drawn. They just draw to each other. They recognized each other, so to speak. It's like an analogy for love. So the Baal HaTanya puts it this way. He uses the expression kiruv hanitzutz el hamoer, which means the close proximity of the spark to its mother flame. That all year round, the spark is on its orbit. But when it comes closer to Elul, as we approach Tishrei, as we approach Rosh Hashanah, the spark in the orbit gets closer to its source. And as such, it feels the tug of the source and is drawn to it. And that's why the Talmud says that's when you should besiege God, because then it's easiest to access. This doesn't mean you can't do it all year round, but it's far easier when you're closer in orbit, when there's less distractions and less layers, as I mentioned. So that's why the high holidays are of the entire year is the holiest time of the year. Not because, as I said, there's more of God there, but it's easier from our perspective. There's actually a fascinating statement when the end of the high holiday season, which is coming soon after the summer. Yeah, time flies. Summer's almost over. Not yet, but So at the end of the season, the Shmini Atzeret, end of Simchas Torah. So there's an expression that says, the Talmud says, the Medrash says, that God says, after the 7 days of Sukkot, make one special day where you and I will celebrate together, because Koshe Alai Pridaschem. Because after this rich holiday season, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, it's going to be hard for me, your separation. It's like when you're very close with someone and you spend a month with them, the last days are not easy. So God says, let's designate one day before we separate. Now, separate means only from our perspective. So the question is asked, why does it say Koshe Alai Pridaschem? In Hebrew, it should say Koshe Alai Pridasenu. I'll translate. Koshe Alai Pridaschem means it's difficult your separation. God should have said it's difficult our separation. And the answer is obvious, because God never separates from us. We separate from God. To use a not such a positive example, when a soul leaves this earth, a parent, a loved one, and no one should ever know of this, but when there is a death, that we know it's only one-way street in a sense. The soul sees us, we just don't see the soul. We don't see energy, but energy sees us, put it that way. So as such, Koshe Alai Pridaschem, it's your separation, because you're going to be going back into your blindness, where you're going to be convinced that there's no one watching you. And you're going to think that your existence is an existential lonely one, where there's no one but you. That's what loneliness is about. In 3 weeks will be Tisha B'Av. Mashiach hopefully will be here. But we say, if not, Lamentations. It's a question, maybe we'll still say it when Mashiach comes and understand Eicha in a positive way. But the first opening statement in Eicha, which is woe. Woe, Eicha Yoshva Badad. Alas, or woe, that she sits alone. That's what Jeremiah, the prophet, saw when he looked at Jerusalem. So of all the things, I've discussed this a number of times, of all the things that Jeremiah saw that bothered him, he opens up the book of Lamentations, the book of Eicha, with what? The loneliness of Jerusalem. A number of years ago, I had a radio show in New York. It was on WEVD, which was since been sold to ESPN. No, I didn't. I wasn't a shareholder, so I didn't make anything on it, the deal. But I was a host. I had Sunday 6 to 7, an hour live show, which call-ins and all that. 2.5 years. It was in the late 90s, the turn of the century. It sounds ancient. Turn of the 20th century. It was a live show, and as I said, 6 to 7. It was a popular show. A lot of calls. I used to have phone. The calls were all off the hook. And I used to choose all kinds of very provocative, controversial topics. And I remember there was a few times as an aside, since it was 6 to 7 on Sunday, so it also conflicted with the Super Bowl. So of course that I didn't cancel the show. I simply apologized to the NFL for taking away any of their viewers that Sunday, whoever ended up listening to that. But that's a joke in case you're. I don't think they're worried about me yet. And then ESPN bought the station. That was the ultimate justice. So I did a show on loneliness. I happened to be in California that week, so I had to do it from California. Now, I became good friends, it's a long story of its own, with a fellow called Leonard Cohen. You may know Leonard Cohen, singer-songwriter. And of course, loneliness is his big theme. Depression, loneliness, everything. He's made, they say, depression fashionable. Okay? Brought it out of the closet, so to speak. So I met him that day, on Sunday. Since California 3 hours behind, my show was 6 o'clock, so I had some time, and we spent some time. Then he told me, I have a studio in the back, why don't you use it? So, of course, I had the chutzpah, and I said to him, why don't you come on the show? I'm talking about loneliness. It was literally Erev Tisha B'Av. The show was Sunday night. I think Tisha B'Av was Tuesday that year. So I chose the topic. Loneliness seems like an appropriate topic for the 9 days, based on the Echa Yoshva Bada, the loneliness. So he told me he would love to come, but it's legally too complicated. He'd have to get permissions. It would be a whole thing. Because he had all kinds of contractual obligations. No, it was true. But he said, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll give you a poem on loneliness that I've never given anyone, and you can read it on the air tonight. And he gave me a new poem, which I read, and it was Leonard Cohen's poem. That's just to get your attention. Now I'll tell you what my point was. I'm just kidding. You wouldn't be here if you thought, I didn't advertise Leonard Cohen. But so I talked about this topic. Why of all things, the destruction of the temple brought many tragedies together. First of all, many people were killed. So there you got a big tragedy right there. The temple, the holy temple, was destroyed. The beginning of the long exile in Golos. Okay, it's true. Echa is talking about the first temple, but it's still the same theme. The exile, the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. The Holy of Holies desecrated. I mean, there's so many things. Of all the things Jeremiah was bothered by most, that he opens up the book of Echa, Lamentations, is the loneliness. Yoshva Ba'echa, alas, woe, she sits alone. He's talking about Jerusalem, not even a person. When you read it, you may think it's a person. He's talking about Jerusalem like it was a woman or a man. She sits alone. So why loneliness? Then he goes on. There's plenty of other tragedies that he describes that befell the people, the Jews then. But the fact that he opens with loneliness. So I never saw this interpretation. It just was my own thought. And I say it here, feel free to rebut it if you like, or give a better interpretation. I thought to myself, the greatest tragedy of all is loneliness. Even though in magnitude, obviously, killing people, a Holocaust is clearly a worse tragedy technically than being lonely, or the other things I mentioned. But think of it this way. If we were not so lonely in our tragedies, in our losses, it would be far easier to deal with. What happens when a person suffers a loss, a death, an untimely one, or any particular personal tragedy or collective one, the hardest part is you feel you're completely isolated. You always ask, where is God? Where's the people that said they're my friends? Where are they? And you convince yourself, and sometimes it's true, sometimes not even true, that nobody can really understand you, because no one can suffer. No one else can understand you in your suffering. And many people even don't want to invite people there. It's not fair. I don't want people to have to be a burden on them. If you knew, and I don't say anyone here shouldn't suffer, but if a person knew that you're not alone, we would be able to overcome any challenge. Because there's someone else that can hold your hand. Someone's shoulder you can lean on. A sympathetic ear. These things go a long way. You go to a hospital, God forbid, and you see someone who has no visitors. It has to have a negative impact. Because you lose the hope, you lose the strength, you lose the willpower to fight. And doctors will say, the immune system is directly fed by a person's inner will and strength. It's not the only factor, but it's a big factor. And you go to someone else who has visitors and gifts, there's a certain, you want to fight because there are people that are believing you, there are people that love you, and they show you, and they say, yeah, there's something to live for. Ask someone who says, I have nothing to live for. It's the saddest thing to hear. Because then they give up. So though I'm not comparing, can't compare, as I said, the magnitude of a tragedy, but the loneliness is what Jeremiah, it wasn't that it was just bothered, so-called romantically, that Jerusalem is sitting alone. He saw the worst thing of all is not that all this is happening, but Jerusalem is left alone. And that, my friends, is what I began speaking about, that thousands of years have passed, and the siege continues. To me, it's like mind-blowing. The Babylonians over 2,300 years ago, the Romans over 1,900 years ago, and the siege continues. One way or another. Yes, it's true today we have an army, and we have a strong country, we could defend ourselves, and more than that. Not taking away, that's a great blessing. But it's still embattled. Someone just came back from Israel, Velvel. He was in Israel just till this Sunday. So he said to me, in Jerusalem you don't really feel what's going on, but go a little south, the trauma of, because the rockets, thank God, very few casualties, but it doesn't matter, it's the fear. You don't know what's going to hit when. Children growing up with that, and it's unexpected. It's not even a war. Wars are fought in certain regions. Here it could land anywhere. So Israel is still in that state. We're not even talking about the siege from all the nations and all the condemnations, etc., etc., etc. And I don't want to go into analysis whether Israel is its own worst enemy and brought on this itself by behaving certain ways, which is also true. Now is not the time to be critical like that. But the bottom line is, it's a mess. But thank God, yes, today, as opposed to the Romans and Babylonians, they're not. But remember, the walls have already been breached. There's no temple. There's a mosque there now. So it's not exactly Gan Eden either. It's just that we have a nation, and we have a people, and we have, thank God, strength and willpower. We're not going anywhere. But it's amazing, 3 weeks, and we're still, sometimes you could say, okay, we're commemorating something that happened thousands of years ago. No, it's happening right now. Just a different form. It's a different name, different year. And the answer is, for all of this, going back to what I said, is because this is, as Yaakov says, Shara Shamayim. And a place that is a gate to heaven has a sanctity to it that no other place has, and in some way, consciously or unconsciously, everyone on earth knows it. That's why it dominates. It doesn't matter how many people live there and how large the land is. If it's a gate to heaven, everyone is drawn to that. And that's why the battle over Jerusalem, you go every time to the old city. I always, walk through the corridors of the old city at night. And you have the Jewish quarter, of course. Okay, that makes sense. The Muslim quarter, the Christian quarter. How the Armenians got into there, I have no clue. I did a little research. I think they placated them or something at the beginning of the 20th century because they massacred them, the Turkish. So I guess they threw them a bone. But whatever, they're in there. Okay. Also, if you want to know, I did a lot of trivia research. I know it's kind of funny, the whole thing, if it wasn't so tragic. The bells are ringing. The what's the call of the prayer that they have there, whatever it's called. What's the name of the call to prayer? Muslim call to prayer. Yeah. And then we have our broken wall. They have the mosques are beautiful. You walk down those steps, you see the golden dome. The bells sound angelic. But the Jews have a broken wall. But like we say, Eden like to say, they say there's nothing as, I'll say it in Yiddish and then I'll translate. Es ist nicht in gleichere Sach wie a krumme Leiter. Es ist nicht in krimmere Sach wie a Gleichwertel. Und es ist nicht in ganze Sach wie a zerbrochene Herz. Translated goes like this. There's nothing as crooked as a straight ladder. Oh, no. I'm sorry. There's nothing as crooked as a straight lie, like a white lie. There's nothing as straight as a crooked ladder. And there's nothing as complete as a broken heart. So what does that mean exactly? I don't remember. There's nothing as straight as a white lie. There's nothing as crooked as a straight lie. Like a straight lie. There's nothing as straight as a crooked ladder. And there's nothing as complete as a broken heart. Because when you really love something, and if you're just cool about it and your heart doesn't break, it's not there. You have to feel it. And even halachically, when is tshuva? When you bring an offering for kapara, for redeeming yourself, you have to have a broken heart. You can't just say, oh, you know what? Hey, I'm bringing an offering in the temple. Let's celebrate. You have to experience it. You have to feel it inside you. So we have a broken wall. But that broken wall is more complete, I would submit, than some beautiful architecture. Because beautiful architecture is nice on the outside. What's going on the inside is the question. And a broken heart is a pure thing. So what Jeremiah saw that night, or that day when the temple was destroyed, what bothered him most, what he saw most, was the loneliness that the city, and of course the people, and for history would feel. That would be the difficult one. They'll say, where is God? I feel alone. I don't feel there's anyone watching, anyone cares. That's the hardest thing. No, does anyone care about me? And I would submit again, if you felt someone cared, you could endure anything. If you don't feel someone cares, everything becomes very difficult. So just like as I said in time, shana nefesh, olam shana nefesh, as the Sefer Yetzirah says, everything breaks into time, space, and soul and person nefesh. So there's holiness in nefesh, which is the Kohen Gadol is the holiest person. There's the holiest in space is the Kodesh Kodashim, the Holy of Holies in the temple, Yerushalayim Ir HaKodesh, Eretz HaKodesh. As the Mishnah says, there's 10 levels of holiness in Israel. General Israel, then it breaks down slowly, you get closer to the Temple Mount. In the Temple Mount itself, the Holy of Holies is the holiest of all. What does holiness mean? As I explained, the layers are very thin, which means that there are very few veils. And you can access the divine in the easiest possible way. And this in a way is like the vortex, the source of energy. As Jacob said, Shara Shamayim, there's a gate to heaven, a portal to heaven. So think of it as an example, one of the examples given in Hasidic texts. Take the human body. The human body, your soul, gives life from head to toe. Right? To say a person, for example, is alive, you don't split life into pieces. It's one life, you're alive. What does it mean you're alive? From the top of your head to the tip of your toe, you're alive. God forbid, if there's no life in one part of the body, it compromises the rest of the body. And yet, there's still difference between vital organs and organs that are not as vital. We could function, for example, without, God forbid, with something missing. But you can't function without a brain, without a mind. So the Kabbalists explain, and actually it's not just the Kabbalists, also the Halachas. The Ramah, who's a great codifier, he wrote what's called the map, the tablecloth, so to speak, to the Shulchan Aruch. He wrote, so the Ramah has a sefer called Teres Ha'ela. It's the Torah of the offering called the Oila. It's one of the temple offerings. And it's an entire book dedicated to something very relevant to our time right now, and that is the temple. He explains in Kabbalistic form how every aspect of the temple parallels the human body and our lives. And there are other books that also, the Shalom writes about it, the Bachaye, others that talk about that this temple was structured like the human body, which really is structured like the Adam Elyon, Selam Elokim. There were 3 main sections in the temple. The Holy of Holies, Kodesh, the Holy, and the Heichel, and the Azara, the Oil Moyed. So you have 3 sections. And in the body you have Moyach, Leiv, Kovet. You have the brain, the head. That's like the Holy of Holies. Where was the Aron, the Ark, with the Torah in it? Was in the Holy of Holies. Then you have the Kodesh, is like the torso, which is, you have 3 main parts, the right, left, and center, the heart, which is the inner Mizbeach, the inner altar, and you have the menorah and the shulchan. Right, left, and center. 3. And then you have the outer altar in the outer section, that's like the bottom of the legs. And they describe it at length. When Yecheskel asked God, the temple is going to be destroyed, how will we ever rebuild it? So God said to him, study the laws of the 3rd temple, and I will consider it as if you're rebuilding it. Which is why some people have the custom to study Hilchos Beis Abchira, the laws of building the temple in the Maimonides, or Masechta Tamid, Masechta Midas, which talk about what the temple was like. Because Kol ha'esek b'Teres Ha'ela, it says, the Talmud says, Kol ha'esek b'mincha. If you study the laws of something, it's like Kilu Hikra, as if you did it. So, but more importantly, is because each of us is a microcosm of the temple. In that context, you can say each of us is a microcosm of Israel, which is not a surprise. Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, and Am Yisrael, the nation of Israel. It's exactly the same name. So when we talk about Eretz Yisrael and why it dominates headlines, and why the whole world looks at it and why it continuously is in the news, is very simple. It's the gate to the portal to heaven, and everyone, consciously or unconsciously, is drawn to that. That is the fundamental reason. I know we could start finding historical reasons and all kinds of other stuff, but you have to, at the end of the day, why there and why that space. So when we talk about and our concerns of what's going on there, especially here, many of us feel, this is our brothers and sisters. So if they're under siege, we should feel under siege, just because we're here. We already learned our lesson, and I don't want to compare it to the Holocaust, but the American Jewry was plenty complicit, didn't do what it had to do. I don't want to, al-tiftach pem, not even comparing this, but the bottom line, a Jew anywhere is attacked is a Jew anywhere, because if you live there, you're a target like anyone else is a target. So we have to ask ourselves two questions. Number one, what's going on, and what can we do about it? So what's going on, as I said, is until the day when we will have world peace, when Mashiach will come, the day when there will be an alignment between spirit and matter, and the world will be aligned to what divine purpose it was created, Israel is the place where the most of the chaos will take place. Like it is always that way. Who suffers most when something is not aligned? The heart, the brain, the place where the vortex, not the extremities. When a person is suffering, it's like where does the enemy attack? The jugular. You go where the source of life is. You don't go to other places. That's how it is. In time of war, where does the enemy look for? They look for the commander-in-chief. They want to know where the boss is. Because if you cut off the head, the rest follows. So Israel is in that fortunate and unfortunate position. Which explains a simple thing. Why the Babylonians, the Romans, the Christians, the Muslims, you name it, the Ottomans, everybody wanted Jerusalem. Everybody. The wars in the Middle Ages, the Crusades, everybody wants Jerusalem. Why? You give me some rational explanation. What's so special about the city? Is it beachfront property? No. There's no water there. You have to go to the Dead Sea, which isn't exactly, So it's not beachfront property. It was the Hamptons, I could understand. Everyone's fighting over the Hamptons, but they're not fighting over the Hamptons. The Muslims don't care, the Christians don't care, the Babylonians and the Romans didn't chase, So what is it about Jerusalem? Is it the best climate in the world? It's nice. What is it? No one has a rational explanation. So you could say, because historical, it's to hold the city. It's the city that because the Bible, the best-selling book in all of history, talks about Jerusalem as the city of Yerushalayim. Jerusalem means in Hebrew, Yerushalayim, complete awe of God. You tell that to a lot of people, they say, I didn't know that's what I was fighting for. You should have tell the Romans, you're fighting for complete awe of God. I think if they heard that, they'd go find another city maybe. No, because you know why? Everyone senses the source of energy. It's the source of energy. No one really knows why, but they know it's the source. That's my submission. Obviously, this can be manifest in all kinds of historical reasons and other things. Because at the end of the day, Jerusalem is also not from a strategic point of view. There are other cities that are far more well positioned. For example, you could say near the Suez Canal. Okay, that connects waterways, that connects countries and so on. The answer is it's the spiritual vortex. And whether people acknowledge it or don't acknowledge it, that's the main reason. So how do you fortify that? By being more spiritual. Simple as that. Israel is the source of spirituality. If that would be the main export from Israel and from Jerusalem, and not other things, I have no doubt many of our problems would disappear. So in many ways, Israel is the ultimate paradox. On one hand, it's the holiest country on earth. On the other hand, is the place where the most bloodshed takes place on an ongoing basis. How do you explain that? The only way to explain paradoxes like that is, as the Talmud says, Kol hagadol mechaveri yitzrei gadol mimenu. The greater a force, the greater its challenges. The greater the person, the greater the Yetzer Hara, the greater the temptations. Because everything gravitates to where energy is. Why, for example, do you have to sterilize and do you have to have it to be so infection-free an area where, God forbid, surgery will take place? Why? Because when the internal organs are opened, they're very fragile and vulnerable to what? To bacteria. When the body is closed, bacteria can't really get in. We have skin, layers of skin, hair, all kinds of defense mechanisms. Everyone, as they say in fundraising, you go fishing where the fish are, right? The same is here. Bacteria, all infections, where do they gather? They gather where there's energy. You're never going to find maggots and parasites in an arid area because there's no moisture, there's no light, there's nothing there. You'll always find that where there's a lot of energy, you'll always find negative forces come. This is where the Torah talks about, you ever hear Tuma and Tara. One of these misunderstood concepts. In Torah, there's a concept of purity and impurity. Tuma and Tara. What's the difference between Tuma and Tara? So, and you have the concept, if you're Tomei, you're impure, you have to go to the mikveh. There's certain impurities that need more intense cleansing. What is this impurity? Why can't you just take a shower? Says Maimonides says very clearly, because impurities, now we're not talking about dirt. We're not talking about grime. We're not talking about taking a shower and cleaning off your dirt. We're talking about spiritual dirt. What's spiritual dirt? Spiritual dirt is when there's a lot of energy in a place, there's always what we call negative energy gathers. Think of it, spiritual bacteria. There's a law in the Torah, for example, that says you're not allowed to eat blood. You're not allowed to eat blood. That's why we salt meat, etc. So question, a very klotz kasha. All food you eat breaks down to become your flesh and blood. So why not just eat blood in the first place? It's anyway going to become your blood. So why can you eat a piece of meat or a vegetable or whatever it is? That's not a problem. The fact that it's going to break down and become blood anyway. So why not just drink the blood of an animal? I know it doesn't sound very appealing, but I'm just speaking from a Torah point of view. And the answer is very clear. Ki adam hu nefesh. Because blood is life force itself. And when there's a lot of life force, there's a lot of negative energy gathers there, and you stay away from things like that. Wherever there's a lot of energy, there's always the possible negative. For example, the Holy of Holies. Let's talk about the Holy of Holies. Let's talk about Jerusalem, Israel. Why only once a year, and just for a short while, does the high priest enter the Holy of Holies? And he cannot go in, no one can go in any other time. And I'll take it even further. When the high priest went on Yom Kippur into the Holy of Holies, they tied him with ropes. Why? Because if someone had a blemish or a sin and would go into the Holy of Holies, they would die. And since no one else can go in, so you tie him with ropes to be able to pull him out. I know, it sounds a little... but listen, the Torah is a legal book and you got to cover all scenarios. Now why? Because the Holy of Holies is the most sensitive spot on earth, and every little blemish is significant. I mentioned this, I think, last week. When you have a piece of dust on your finger, it's meaningless. If it's a piece of dust on your eyeball, it can be extremely irritating. Or as Jigan and Schuchmacher, the famous Yiddish linguist and comedian, said, the Jewish theory of relativity goes like this. 3 hairs on your head isn't much. I should know. But 3 hairs in your soup, that's the theory of relativity. It all depends where they are. So, a blemish in a regular place on earth, okay, you got a blemish, big thing. A ravav al beged Talmud Chacham. Talmud says something very strong. Some type of blemish on the garment of a scholar, the Talmud says, I don't even want to repeat that, he deserves the opposite penalty of death. Discuss the reason for that another time. But it means because on a certain level, it's not a blemish. Add 1 dot into a computer program of millions of lines of code, and the whole thing can go wreak havoc. 1 mutant cell among 75 trillion cells in the human body also wreaks havoc. You say, hey, 1 second, 1 cell, 75 trillion cells. Because it's not about quantity, it's about quality. In the wrong place, 1 little addition, 1 subtraction, 1 extra chromosome is Down syndrome. So what do you have from this? That the most sensitive places are the ones that feel the pain the most. That's why people who are when things are not good, who feels the pain? The ones that are on the highest level, the ones that are most sensitized. Desensitized individuals don't feel pain that much. The Holy of Holies is the one that experiences Jerusalem, the loneliness, when there's a tragedy. And that continues till this day. So when you see the sieges, even though there's definitely human beings involved on all sides, and you have all kinds of things, but there's a bottom line is why over that part of the world? Because that's the place that is the one that cries most. That's what Jerusalem is doing, Israel is doing. Even though, as I said, thank God today we have the ability to defend and more than that, but it's still crying. Who needs all this? Imagine if there was no need to spend all that money on a defense budget, what Israel would be like. As it is, it's up there in so many areas. Imagine it would be a place, it would be heaven on earth, literally. Imagine, get rid of all the no enemies, everyone would be at peace. That would be messianic. It's very clear. So the stakes are very high. So where's the fight? That's where the fight is fought, more than anywhere else in the world. And the battle is, don't ever think it's otherwise. It's a spiritual one. And again, I'm not talking about the Hamas shooting rockets. I understand that's not a spiritual action. But the bottom line is, when you start thinking about the animosities, I wrote an article about it, a number of years, we sent it out last week, the root of Arab rage. Ultimately, it's a religious war. It's not a war over land. It's not like Israel is like, it's a religious war. There's no question about it. And you're talking about a spiritual challenge. So when we look in history and we look in precedent, what are Jews to do? We're living here. So obviously in any way you can support physically, financially, in any other way. I know people here who, without hesitation, if there's a call up to the military, they have dual citizenship, will go to Israel. I'm not saying everyone has to do that. Everyone has to make their choices, what they think is their commitment. But remember, we're not separate. Eretz Yisrael is the land of Israel. According to Halacha, as a matter of fact, every Jew has Dalet Amos in Eretz Yisrael. We all have a part of the land. It was separated by Moses, and later, when they entered Israel, it was separated to all the tribes. Every Jew on earth has inheritance in Israel. I don't know if you can go make a claim, because first of all, you have to identify which part. But halachically, it's negay. It's important in halachas of prusbul and other things where you need to have some land in Israel. So there's halachas, laws that state that. So it's not just something happening in another part of the world for us, because there's an Israel within each of us. And don't underestimate the fact that wars are fought on many fronts. There's a physical war, and there's a spiritual war. So what we can do here is when you strengthen your own connection to Yisrael, the Yisrael within you, through an addition in study, in prayer, in charity, in other things, you strengthen the macrocosmic Eretz Yisrael. Obviously, that's not the only thing, but every war is fought on many fronts. You have in the times of King David, so there was Yoav and there was David. He fought on the front, the battle front, and he fought through its prayer and study. We always need both. You always need, just like in an actual army, not everybody is shooting. You need a commander-in-chief, you have generals, you have strategic, you have the communications. There's a whole army, the whole military consists of many departments. And you need them all. You can't just deal with one and not the other. So there's also a spiritual side to every aspect to it. Our hope is that Israel should ultimately have an awakening where the entire nation unites and understands that its power is ultimately the power of this part of the world. I remember walking once in Jerusalem, and I met a couple, young kids, 17-year-old boy and girl, very secular, average Israeli teenagers. So I just stopped them. We started having a conversation in Hebrew. And I asked them, they grew up, this one in Tel Aviv, this one in Haifa, and they had very little relationship with Judaism per se, Torah, in a direct way. But this is their land. And I asked them, let me ask you something. You're now 16, 17 years old. You're going to go to the army. One day you'll marry. You have to send your children to the army. Why do you need all this? Why not just move to another part of the world where you don't have all these challenges? Go to Sydney, London, I don't know, Los Angeles. I just wanted to hear. I wasn't challenging them, but just wanted to hear how two young Jewish teenagers in Israel think. And they both said, this is our land, this is the place we were born, this is Artzenu, and so on. And I saw, even though they didn't articulate it because they didn't know, they didn't have the words for it, there was a connection. Sadly, they didn't get an education. No one ever taught them what Israel really is. So they just sense they're not going anywhere. Which is why you don't have a mass exodus. Listen, you have enough people left. In New York itself, I think It's 200,000. How many Israelis here in New York? Well, more? A million?
1.5 million outside of Israel now.
1.5 million outside. Okay, fine. That's a big number. But there's 6 million there, right? No?
4.5 million Jews.
I thought it surpassed the United States this year. That's
Citizenship, not Jews.
okay. Fine. Who might argue? What?
I thought there were 6 million Jews in Israel.
Okay. Honestly, I didn't do the counting. He says citizenship. Fine. Anyway, however you want to figure it, there's still a lot of Jews there. It's a big number. 4.5 million is a nice number. But the point I want to make is that Jews everywhere feel the connection. I was a kid, but I remember after the 6-Day War, the euphoria that swept over American Jewry when that famous picture of Bob Dylan wearing tefillin at the Kotel and the Time magazine. And it wasn't just that. It was the whole 6-Day War. It changed the consciousness of many, many Jews in this country. Birthright for all the positive and negative things, but bottom line is 250, 300,000 young men and women never forget. You go to Israel, you don't forget it that quickly. What they do as a follow-up is another story, and the continuing connection. But there's no question. I remember the first time I went, I was 14 years old, and I remember, I grew up in yeshiva and all that. It was amazing. I walk in New York, you don't feel it's your land. There, every step you take, who walked here? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the Kohanim. You go to the Jerusalem, you go to Hebron. When I was there in 1971, it was a different world. You could go anywhere, there were no issues altogether. But so the place is saturated with thousands of years of history, thousands of years of sacrifices, and it remains. Eretz HaKodesh is Eretz HaKodesh. Even the most rabid anti-Zionists, I almost say anti-Semites, but anti-Zionists, cannot deny the halachas. The Rambam says, Kedusha le'zazim imkema. This place, which is the barren, holy Temple Mount, is holy till this day. You can't take away holiness. That's why you're not allowed to walk there, etc. And the Eretz HaKodesh has holiness to it. Even if not one Jew is there, it has holiness, by the way. And especially if there are people living there, etc., etc. Not getting down to all the different opinions of how they consider, but no one can take away. Eretz HaKodesh is Eretz HaKodesh. It will always be such. So, what's lacking most, and I don't want to speak B'gnusan in any negative way, it's lacking most is a consistency between Am HaKodesh and Eretz HaKodesh. If the nation there, the people there, everybody, the religious and the non-religious, because frankly, to me, the religious are just like the non-religious in the sense they're all busy with their own interests. If everybody was dedicated to real Kedusha and holiness, you'd have a different world, you'd have a different Israel. Because then the world would respect that. Because that's why they're drawn there in the first place. So maybe that inconsistency, which is also inconsistency anywhere between the Yisrael within each of us, our souls and our bodies, in some way keeps a misalignment and an imbalance in that holy part of the world, because there it's sensitive to every imbalance. As I said, in the part of the universe that's not that sensitized, okay, imbalance. A non-healthy person doesn't feel disease, but a very holy place is going to feel every blemish. So our job is to understand the role of Israel, and most importantly, to act on it. There was which means, like one Rebbe once told the Chassid, says, if you can't go to Israel, don't go to Israel. Magda Eretz Yisrael. Make Israel right here. What does that mean? Sanctify your home. Sanctify your environment. This doesn't mean that if some people can move to Israel, by all means. It's another discussion, why not everyone's going there, etc., etc. But it's not really the theme of this evening. But at the minimum, is we're not separate. We pray toward Israel every day. There's no Jew that doesn't pray toward the east. Israel, Jerusalem, the Temple Mount, because it is the end of the day the center of the universe. Simple as that. Our prayers elevate through there. It says all the prayers in the world go up to heaven through Shara Shamayim, through Yerushalayim. There's a contradiction. Some times it says through Hebron. So, maybe it's two gates, one portal, then to the next, and then upward. But the point is that it remains a central part of Jewish life. We say it every day in Shemoneh Esrei, and many times we pray for Shuvas Tzion, the return of Zion. We say in the holiday prayers, Mipnei Chateinu, because of our sins we were exiled from Galinu Ma'atzenu. And even if you're in Israel, you say it. Why? It's not the physical only, it's the spiritual. You can live in Israel and still be Galinu Ma'atzenu. So our role is to understand what's going on. obviously to do whatever we can to support, but above all, to also in our own personal lives to embrace what Eretz Yisrael means in your own soul, and that everyone has a responsibility to do. And that itself is also a battle and a war. So, let me say that God should help that all our brothers and sisters there should be safe and sound, and all this shagas should stop. Unfortunately, right now, even if it stops, it's not necessarily getting to the root of the issue. It's only the symptoms. That's a whole other discussion how we get to the root. But we should appreciate the blessing that God gave us the ability to be even able to be in Eretz Yisrael. 2,000 years, where almost for 2,000 years we couldn't even go there. So, however one feels of it, the bottom line, it is a blessing, and it's important to appreciate. I will be there actually in 2 weeks from now, for 10 days. So I'll be here. Next week's class will happen, but after that I won't be here for 2 weeks. But I'll do it by broadcast. I'll announce it next week. But I every time one goes there, you feel you're going to a holy place. And God should bless that we should be able to live up to that holiness and be consistent. Sometimes the place is holier than the individuals in the place. And that's one of the challenges why many tzaddikim, righteous people, didn't feel necessarily the ability to live there, because they didn't feel they could live up to the standard that is expected there. Because here you can get away and say, okay, listen, you're living outside of a holy place. If you're in a holy place, you have to be holy as you can be. Again, I'm not saying that's necessarily an excuse for everybody. It's another discussion, who about going there, not living there. But we definitely have to do our part here, because at the end of the day, it's all connected. And it actually indeed says that when Mashiach comes in the future, it says, "Asid Eretz Yisrael shetispashad b'kol ha'aratzos." Israel will, in the future, spread through all the lands. Jerusalem will spread through all of Israel. So, in other words, the holiness that Israel has today will spread, and the whole world will become a holier place. And then Israel itself will elevate to yet another higher place. So we should merit all of that, and we should do our little part in fortifying the walls and the temple. Today the temple is in our hearts and souls, and through our prayers we bring offerings. Tfilas keneged karbonos tiknum. Our prayers correspond to the offerings, and all our other actions are all really rebuilding the temple within. And when you rebuild the temple within, the Migdash Shalmayla, which means the Shalayim Shalmayla, the Migdash Shalmayla means the spiritual temple above, ultimately will merit to be able to fuse it, unite it with the temple below. And each of us should do our part, especially in the 3 weeks, which is on one hand the sad days, but they're also opportune days to remember and to connect. And like it says in the Talmud, a generation that doesn't rebuild the temple is as if they destroyed it. In case you didn't feel guilty enough or responsible enough. Doesn't mean actually to put a guilty on us. It means to show responsibility, because the temple was destroyed, ultimately, the second temple, because of sinas chinam, baseless hatred. So what's the tikkun? What's the repair? Baseless love. Love is the antidote to hate. So we have plenty of issues on that, and plenty to resolve there. So that's another thing we should add. Try to be a little nicer to other people. Don't get involved in machlekes and battles and wars and divisiveness. Ultimately, unity gives us strength, it brings blessings, Barchenu Hashem kolanu ka'echad, and ultimately brings the redemption itself. So again, we honor your mother, Asya, Bat Ben Sion. Ushloishim is tonight, now for sure tonight, right? As I said, Jews should have peace everywhere. The world, everyone should have peace. Our prayers for peace for all people. Everyone should have a very, very peaceful and Eretz Yisrael Dika week. As I said, Philip will be giving his class. What else can I announce? I will give a class next week again, as I said. And if you haven't left us your connection, your contact information, your email, please do so. So until next week, thank you very much.